So a few days ago, I did a piece and used the expression "lazy lions," which expression grew out of some of the material elements of the Yoruba word for thief, and I was exploring in this piece the lazy lions, how the very notion of what constitutes property is inherently ideological and biased and has a history. And that history doesn't belong to a history of equality and justice and human rights. That history belongs to a construction of who is entitled to rights and who is entitled to citizenship and who is entitled to the rights to own, including the rights to own other individuals. And I tried to express in that particular piece, all examples of theft aren't created in our semantic and ideological constructions equally from the outset. And I guess I was thinking about theft, perhaps because there's a project to launch Dante's Divine Comedy into outer space. And I had already been critiquing the colonialist ideology behind launching examples of certain types of humanity into outer space and the inherent biases and prejudices in the last selection that belonged to that project, as much as it pretended to demonstrate a kind of universality. And I guess I was thinking about Dante and in that regard, and the way that Dante ascribes one of the circles of Inferno to thieves, but there are no similar or parallel domains, in Paradiso or Purgatorio for individuals who utilize, their skills and abilities to survive in situations that are unjust and that don't grant them the rights or opportunities or securities of others, that have more easy access to those positionalities of privilege. So I was thinking about that in the Lazy Lions and all of those types of thought that are so protective of certain kinds of property and so willing to assign individuals either places in hell or places in perpetual incarceration, and that being a kind of mindset and often unquestioned, by the individuals that hold such mindsets. So it's one of what I consider my jobs is to question those assumptions. And then today I did another piece in which I utilized the term bias in relationship to testing, and I compared individuals with certain kinds of limitations that are marginalized, that their strategies, right, of getting around the obstacles of biases in say testing situations or in evaluation systems or other applications that the individuals that have certain kinds of limitations or certain kinds of abilities have trouble with, but don't really get assistance with So what I want to do is talk about the way that biases are used on a number of different fronts, but I want to talk about two fronts. One is you might call the front of incarceration or biases of incarceration, and that's what we're looking at right here, right, is a bias of incarceration. And then I want to talk about biases of other kinds of sorting, including other kinds of institutions like educational institutions. So my viewers will realize that whenever I'm talking about testing, that is testing individuals, not say testing a car to make sure that it has, the proper emissions and is street legal, but testing an individual, to see if that individual is college material or belongs, to industrial labor or perhaps should be sent to prison. Those kinds of testing, which, most of my viewers will be aware of. I've been very critical of the sorting mechanism of testing. And that isn't limited to SAT tests, but includes GRE tests and CTBS tests, if you're familiar with that form, and elemental PQRST tests, or whatever those tests might be that sort individuals in a biased manner, but which rely upon this illusion or delusion of fairness, right? And what I want to do in this discussion is talk about my difficulties with these kinds of testing, and I'll focus on this latter bias in sorting, but I'll briefly discuss sorting in the institution of incarceration as well. So I'll begin with that, and I'll just begin with one of my experiences of the institution of incarceration. But my critique of the institution of incarceration goes way back, even before I had met Dennis Brutus, and before I had worked and studied his work, and before we had talked about ways of exposing certain kinds of institutional biases. But I'm not gonna talk about that relationship and certain work I did in Washington, D.C. and New York. I'm going to talk about my experiences in, of all places, Flagstaff. And take it from there. All right, so I couldn't find on the World Wide Web any images from the inside of the Flagstaff prison jail facility. Oh wow, 911. That's really interesting. So I had to choose this image from the outside. So you'll my listeners and my viewers will have to take my word that what I describe as the human tragedy of what in fact we see on the inside of this prison is correct. I do have a little bit of confirmation here, and this is sort of pre-confirmation. Navapache bail bonds. Interesting, right? Okay, so combining the two words Navajo and Apache. And why would that be? Well, because this particular facility is largely hosts Native American population. Okay, and again, this is Flagstaff, right? Okay, so hold on a second. All right, so here, excuse all the interruptions today. I didn't prepare well enough. But here are the demographics for the city of Flagstaff, Arizona. All right, so the demographics are 78.34% white, okay? Native American and Alaskan natives, I don't know why they separated all of that out. That's just Native American, period, okay? 7.85%. Two or more races. Okay, African American isn't even on here, right? Two or more races, 5.27%. And some other race, 3.21%. Okay, so obviously it's almost entirely white, right? Okay, let's go back to the picture. All right, so why, if the population is almost 80% white, would you have Navapache bail bonds? Well, because almost all of the individuals interred in this particular facility are Native American. And I know this not by word of mouth or by academic literature, but by having been in this particular facility for some time. And it doesn't really matter what the charge was. I will mention what the charge was, but it doesn't really matter, because what mattered was the fact that I was there and I got to experience the phenomenon of this particular jail. The reason that I was there was I had gotten into an altercation with someone who was harming their animal, and I had stopped this individual from harming an animal, and a gun was pulled, and I removed the gun from the individual who pulled the gun, and then the police were called, and I was arrested for attempted trespassing, which was weird because I don't know how you would attempt trespassing. And I wasn't trespassing since I was staying in the same motel as the individual with the gun who was harming the animal. But anyway, all of that got me into this facility. And then, no one showed up at the trial to press charges because, well, I wasn't trespassing, and how could you be attempting trespassing anyway? And I guess no one wanted to admit that they were harming their animal. So in any case, those charges were dropped, but I was there for quite a while, waiting for a trial. And in the course of waiting for the trial, I got to experience the community in that particular facility. And in the time that I was in this facility, okay, during the time, there were two other, other than myself, there were two other white individuals, right, that would fall under this category white, right, as in the 78%. And one of those individuals was there when I arrived and then left. And then I was the only white individual in the facility for some time. And then another white individual arrived, and then I left. And so, he would have been the only white individual at the time. So there were never more, in the 2 weeks that I was there were never more than two white individuals in this facility at one time. And in the time that I was there were never less than one. Okay. Even though African American doesn't even appear on the demographics for Flagstaff, during the time that I was there was an individual who was there before I entered, and I left before he left, who was African American. So there was always one African American. And the rest of the population were either Mexican American or Native American, all right? And largely Native American, and hence Navapache bail bonds. All right. Now, So this particular mechanism of sorting, has all kinds of working parts in its apparatus, right? And so we know that one of those working parts is the inherent racism of the police department, right? The violence that is overwhelmingly used in relationship to African Americans and Native Americans when arrests are made. We know about profiling. We know about racial discrimination and the unfairness of the courts, right? And we know that more African Americans receive the death penalty by far, right, than the white population, and that all of the elements of the system that is dedicated to incarceration are part of the racial structure of our United States of America. And we know all of this. And we don't always talk about it, but what's the point of institutionalizing marginalized individuals? Well, the point is to further marginalize, I believe, and to take away rights. So the taking away of rights does a number of things. It prevents people, it gets people out of society, right? Further displaces marginalized bodies, and it further removes individuals' rights, right? So we're not taking away your rights because you're black, right? This is the line. This is always the conservative line. You're not in jail because you're black. You're in jail because you committed a crime. You're not in jail because, we're not taking away your rights to vote because you're black. We're taking away your rights to vote because you committed a crime. Well, the reason that you're in there in the first place is because of certain biased systems that collude and collaborate together to take away your rights, and so that your already marginalized positionality becomes further marginalized, and you're effectively removed, right? In the same way that individuals who were labeled insane, in different moments in histories, in not only American culture but in cultures around the globe, were removed to sometimes asylums, sometimes islands, sometimes asylums inside of islands. And it's similar for different kinds of marginalities, right? All right, so that's part of this institutional biased system that we can call the institution of incarceration, and it interlocks with other systems of biases, right, including an educational one. So I've talked a little bit about how this works in terms of population and evidence of that using an example from Flagstaff. I want to turn to a different life history and narrative of my own experiences to demonstrate how it works in testing situations and the institutions of education. So I'll do that. All right. So this is I really like this image for what I'm going to talk about next. So this is an image from the Wikipedia site for the Scholastic Aptitude Test. And then I like the way it's speaking and saying achieve more, because it reminds me so much of the kind of work that I do. And look at that, it has a little registered trademark symbol. And part of also what I do is to deal with these delusions of property and how fair and just and how much right people have to their copy and their property. And so it's a beautiful image for all that we are going to do. And I'll begin again with some personal narrative and talk about my experience of equality under the law of testing. So in order to achieve more, you have to get a high score on these kinds of tests. And I've talked a bit about what I refer to as my dysgraphia, and I'll recover some of that discourse and describe it in some detail again here. So I have a certain kind of limitation in a number of abilities, and viewers and attendants and listeners to my pieces on YouTube will be more than familiar and have more than enough evidence of these disabilities, but they include the following things. It's very difficult for me to write with a pencil and to make markings with a pen or a device that I hold in my hand that falls within the acceptable limits of what's considered good writing or coloring in the lines. So I'm not a big fan of coloring books, as you could imagine. It's very difficult for me to stay within the lines. And in terms of the physical contact of most of these tests, which is the Scantron, it is nearly impossible for me to fill in with the fineness that the machine who evaluates your response requires to tidily and neatly enough fill in the little bubbles, right? Okay, so that's one problem that I have with the Scantron is getting the graphic signification that is readable by the machine in the process of answering the responses is very difficult for me to do, and often requires erasure, and often the erasure leads to perforations in the Scantron testing material itself and other issues. Now, another issue that I have, and I don't know if this is strictly a dysgraphic issue or if it belongs to something else like dyscalculia, but I have a very hard time sequencing numbers in terms of consecutive number counting, okay? So oddly, it doesn't affect my ability to do multiplication or division, so I can count by 40s just as well as I can count 1, 2, 3, 4, 5. I can count 40, 80, 120, 160 just as easily, and I can go from there. So the multiplying isn't the problem, the counting is, the adding is. 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8. I know the numbers and I know how they go, but to count them out without missing one is very difficult for me. So I often refer to it as a kind of plus or minus, and so the range of plus or minus for me is fairly high, so within a sequence of say 20, we're already at plus or minus 1. So it helps if I already know what to associate whatever the multiplication series is. So if I know that counting to 20 ends on a particular thing, then I can just remember that thing and go there. But if I actually have to count it out, it becomes really difficult. Okay, so counting is really difficult, keeping track is really difficult of that kind of thing, and then inscribing the little things. And then spelling is nearly impossible because I read almost entirely by sight words, right? I never really sound anything out letter by letter because the word, in order for me to read it, I have to be familiar with the entire shape of that word as a gestalt in and of itself, right? So if I encounter a word in a text that I don't know, I won't be able to, it'll take me a long time to articulate what that word is. And it's easy to go to the dictionary and look it up, but what's hard is to recognize it again. So most people can probably recognize that word again just by going from letter to letter to letter. But for me, it requires about 1,000 more times than it would for anyone else. So even learning to read, I didn't learn to read by phonics. I learned to read more the way I imagine a writer of and reader of Chinese characters would learn to read by amassing a visual vocabulary of a large number of characters. And for me, the characters were like the whole word shapes. So that achieve is one word shape and more is another word shape. And I don't really grasp, the individual letters in doing that. I can break them down and do it, but it takes a long time and it's really slow. So look here, more also has a registered trademark. So in order to achieve more, according to the SAT, you have to get registered, right? Okay, this is very much my experience of trying to achieve more in a world that is totally registered and doesn't provide assistance in those areas where you would think that you qualify for it. All right, so growing up and in the time that I was in school, no one identified my particular set of limitations and abilities as a set. So no one ever. I didn't get a diagnosis, right? I just got laughed at. I got, my spelling sucked. Like even professors have said that, as I've mentioned, and a lot of name calling, and in not more than one area, because counting is a thing, right? And mathematics is a thing, and I never even knew that I was good in math until I was forced into a high math situation where counting and adding weren't the biggest constraints. But in any case, I'll describe some of the limitations that I have with these tests. All right, so the first time that I took the SAT, I already knew there was going to be trouble because in the California school system they have California aptitude and general aptitude tests that precede college entrance exams and stuff like that. So I already knew this was going to be a problem. I didn't realize how much of a problem it was going to be until I was sitting down to take the test. But at some point I realized that the numbers on the Scantron that I was marking did not correspond to the answers that I had intended to put into the test. Okay. So you have to imagine that you've spent like an hour on this test and then you realize that you're on the wrong number, but of course you don't know where you went on the wrong number. So I had to backtrack at that point. And this was very much like my experience with CTBS tests and other kinds of tests like this in growing up. And so I had to backtrack and like look at all the answers and okay, that one's wrong, that one's wrong, that one's wrong. I had to find my way back. And then it's very anxiety producing because you realize that this is timed and you only have so much time, and I also realize that there's no guarantee that I'm not going to get off track again. So it's very, very psychologically frustrating. And in addition to this, I didn't mention this, but the writing for me, and I think for other dysgraphics too, is actually physically painful. And it's not only time consuming, but it hurts. And it's a kind of, there's a cramping, but it's also like just inexplicable psychological pain associated with writing. And it's so fatiguing that, to do what I do now and write this book that I'm writing with my hand is almost unbearable. The only thing that's more unbearable is the emotional weight that goes into writing this book. So, in any case, I'm erasing. I find the spot that I went off course, and I start doing it again, and I start doing it again, and I'm pressed for time, and I'm struggling with time, and then at some point, I realize I'm off course again, and I'm going to have to, go back, and once again, find the spot that I lost track of the sync, between the question that I'm answering and my ability to fill it in the Scantron, and so Before I start erasing, I'm really in a lot of pain already, and then I experience, what I refer to as, a space-time travel experience, and I imagined or experienced, or it doesn't really matter to me the way that one conceives it. If one conceives of it as a hallucination or a delusion, or if one conceives of it as a way that the mind protects itself or whatnot. I'm not really interested in that. What's interesting to me is that the phenomenon occurs, and what happened was I was transported in a certain sense, in my mind, and what helped me to deal with the pain was this impression, this perception that I had of music playing, and I kind of knew what it was. It was Jimi Hendrix's guitar, and but there was more synth in it. It definitely had. It was definitely more synthesized than I was familiar with any of Jimi Hendrix's work, and it wasn't a piece that I knew by Hendrix, and I knew the whole repertoire. I was a big Hendrix fan, and so this piece was an instrumental, and there were no other instruments other than the guitar, and it had this synthesized feel to it, but it transported me from this testing situation into a space-time travel situation. Well, eventually that evolved into my take on the SAT with, what I refer to as space-time travel aptitude testing and technical training services, right? Which is a acronymic palindrome, but instead of the SAT, we have, well, it was stats, but now it's STTATTS or something like that. So that was, one of the experiences that I had of the SAT, and so I didn't get into regular college right away because I had the bad scores, and even though I had won a high school literature award or whatever, and even though some individuals knew that I could write, colleges didn't want to take me. So I spent some time in junior college, and then I managed to get good grades, and eventually with those grades and without the help of an SAT score, I got into the University of California at San Diego. All right, so now here we go. Here's some more stuff. Now I can say this stuff because for all effective purposes, I'm retired, because I never really managed to make it in academia because I wasn't registered. I didn't have the registered trademark, so I couldn't really achieve more. And I'll explain some of that. But I can confess to being a lazy lion now, and to my crimes against academia and its testing services, because it really has nothing to offer me anymore. I was so effectively barred, right? I was so effectively sorted into the other institution, right, that I don't really have to worry about what this institution thinks of me anymore. Okay, so that having been said, at UCSD, I used to go out of my way, right, to try to deal with some of these issues that my limitations would give rise to. For example, at UCSD at that time, the campus was divided into a number of different schools, and these schools had different requirements, and they had names like the one that I went to was Warren, and then they had Muir, and then they had what else did they had? Third was another one that was new, and they all had different academic requirements. All right, so I chose Warren, and the reason that I chose Warren was because at that time, it was the only school that didn't have a math requirement. And you could opt out of math and take symbolic logic. Well, so I did because of my counting issues. Well, it turned out that, I had the same problem with symbolic logic that I did with with numerical sequencing. So that didn't work out too well. And then later, it turned out that I couldn't get a teaching certification in the teaching of English, right? Because I didn't take college level algebra, and I had to go back and deal with that. Anyway, it was a mess. So not only was it a mistake, but that strategy, effectively like created a lot of additional obstacles. Was it lazy? Not really. It was that I really couldn't do it, and I really It's like asking a blind person to see. Just try harder. I'm sure you'll be able to see it if you just open your eyes a little more, right? Yeah. So I was familiar with that, and it gets a little tiresome and tedious. Oh, and I want to underscore the fact that I'm telling these stories about my personal experience because I absolutely believe that other marginalized positionalities within our culture, right, are equally denied access to these kinds of institutions because of biases inherent in these kinds of testing situations. In other words, it's not just individuals with dysgraphia that the SAT and the GRE are biased against. They're equally biased against African Americans. They're equally biased against Native Americans and others that these tests are not designed with a certain kind of access to a certain kind of information in mind, right? And hence the registered trademark. So, I hope that, my listeners and viewers will keep in mind that my sharing of my experiences are an analogy, for all of the lazy lions, okay? And why lazy lions develop strategies of being lazy, that is, of theft within these institutions, because they effectively, those strategies are the only thing that they can do to keep them afloat. So I would look for, classes and teachers and professors who I knew didn't require writing tests, in line. Those tests where at the end of the class or in the middle, either, for the final or the midterm or both, you're required to bring in blue books and your little sharpened pencil, and they give you a question and you write in your little blue book for an hour. Well, I require more like 5 hours. And it's not that anything to do with not knowing the information. It's everything to do with getting it out in a way that someone else can actually read it. Okay? And then I would also need a lot of breaks in order to do that. But none of that ever came into play. No one ever offered me an opportunity, to do something else, So I would look for those teachers and professors who I knew, didn't require that. And on those rare occasions, and I'll admit to this as well, on those rare occasions when I did have to take an in-class writing exam where I had to use my hands to write the words in one of those blue books, I had to develop strategies outside the law of the copyright tested services to survive those tests. And I'll give an example, and it's a personal example, and some of my viewers may even know this example. So I was taking a class in the French avant-garde from a professor. I don't know if he was a full professor at the time, but from a professor who was visiting from SUNY Albany. So some of my readers will, guess who this is by that description. If you guess, someone familiar with French avant-garde poetry who was a professor around what year would that be? Around late 80s at SUNY Albany, then you know who I'm talking about. So it was a great class, and then at the end, we had to bring in these blue books, and we had to fill them with our words. And I was very much aware that I wouldn't have time to do that. Not only just in English, was it going to be a problem, but I also had the additional problem of this was a class in French and I had to produce everything in French. So not even getting into the difficulties that I had with English, they were compounded when I had to write in another language. So what I did was, I performed the function of theft or cheating, or, I played the part of the lazy lion, and I guessed what the questions would be, and I filled out, I spent a lot of time, and I filled out, individual blue books with my responses in my hand, and I brought them with me. And my intention was to write, instead of the 3 or 4 responses, I would produce one, and then I would turn in the others. And I guessed right, and I'll just use the professor's first name. And I turned the blue books into Pierre, and I managed to pass the class. I may even have gotten an A, but I doubt it very much because my performance in handwritten French was really extremely poor. But that's how I survived, right? Okay, so that's academic dishonesty, right? And the reason that I'm telling this story is because this is another way that marginalized subjectivities become further marginalized and further displaced and further become part of the institution of incarceration. Did I manage to get through college at all and without being violated for academic dishonesty is remarkable. And the reason for the dishonesty, right, was because the system was stacked against me to begin with. I really, really had a lot of difficulty performing within the confines and constructs that were designed without really much consideration for an individual with a physical embodiment and with a phenomenology like mine, and a set of cognitive abilities and inabilities like mine. And there's, you could say, oh, well, why didn't you just tell someone? Well, this is the way it works in a system like this when you tell someone. And I'll jump to a different example. So here's a different example. So I need to do something for court, right? And it requires filling out all of this paperwork, like pages and pages of paperwork that you have to fill out by hand. And I inform them, I say, I'm sorry, but I can't do this. I know I legally have to do this, and I'm obligated to fill this paperwork out, but I have this disability, and I'm going to need some help. And this is what I was informed. It's like, okay, so if you need assistance, you have to fill out these forms, and then they handed me a whole bunch of other forms to fill out. And they said, fill out these forms, and then we can, we'll process this, and we'll get back to you and see if we can assign someone to assist you. So in other words, in order to get the assistance that I needed to fill out the forms, I had to fill out even more forms, right? And I tried to explain to them the paradoxical and illogical response that designated, but they just ended up getting mad. And a lot of times what happens if you request help is eventually they call the police. I have honestly had the police called on me before because I requested assistance. And that's also documented here on this YouTube site, but you have to really look for it. But this is the way it is, and this is the way it's always been, and you can't just tell someone that you can't do it, because the response is, well, if you can't do it, that's too bad, because that's the way it's done, right? And no one ever wants to say, hey, the reason that you got a poor score is because our system of fairness is totally biased, right, against African Americans, against Native Americans, against people with disabilities. It's always your problem, right? You just broke the law, never mind like that you're breaking the law is a solution set, to staying alive or, surviving in a system that's hostile to you from the very outset, right? I remember Chomsky, Noam Chomsky on one YouTube video that I watched, saying, because he was in an interview and one of the questions, was like, he was arguing, that, once you submit to a position of, labor in the United States, you've effectively like sold yourself to all of the constraints and conditions of that labor situation, right? That involves like all kinds of abandonment of one's rights and opinions and personal dignity and the submission to rules and regulations that have nothing to do with what your job should be about. And then the interviewer says, well, of course, what the argument against what you're saying is that you have a choice. You can always not have that job. And Chomsky very much very much reminded me of myself. It goes, yeah, you have the right to starve, right? You have the right to starve, or you have the right to be sorted into something else, like an institution of incarceration, right? So that's what I had the right to, was not assistance or but I had the right just not to be there in the institution to begin with, right? So I was thinking about that when I made the piece on biases and these solutions to coming up with these like elaborate solutions that sometimes just get labeled as theft, or like you should be assigned to the hell of thieves. because why? Because you came up with a solution to a problem that basically has to do with the way that society marginalizes you, right? Okay, so let's go back, to the story. So, all right. So this was the SAT. I took the SAT, and then we don't need to go to an image of GRE because it's the same, right? But when I took the GRE, because I did manage to make it through undergraduate university and attain a degree, in spite of the difficulties of it all. But with, like I said, with having these certain limitations. But I managed to get the degree, and then I wanted to go on and, see if I could make it through graduate school. So I had to take the GRE. Okay, well, I already knew it was coming. I already knew it was going to be bad. And then I think I've already, yeah, of course I have. So I've already described the situation with my letters of recommendation, how I had a professor who, I don't know what it was, but this professor that I had, right? So he obviously he didn't want to write me a letter of recommendation, and because the way that he wrote it was so completely bizarre, and his instructions to me were so completely bizarre. But this professor that I had wrote 2 lines in his letter of recommendation, and when I came to pick it up, he hadn't sealed the envelope, and he suggested to me that I write his name backwards to seal the envelope. Well, I've talked about that already, and what the thing I didn't talk about was that there were like 2 or 3 spelling and grammatical errors in the 2 sentences that he wrote in his letter of recommendation, and I assumed that either he had lost his cognitive functioning earlier than most individuals care to admit about this particular professor, or that it was a parody of my own limitations in writing, particularly writing letters graphically with my hand, and I always assumed that it was just a parody of my inability. If not, I guess something else, but so there was a problem with the letter of recommendation. And I already knew that there was going to be a problem with the GED because there's or GED, GRE, because there's nothing I could do about that kind of testing, So I was basically relying on my writing, and I know my writing was pretty good, and I had the opportunity to type that out, so a lot of the problems that existed with the handwriting wouldn't be apparent there. And I had some pretty decent papers. So pretty much I was relying, entirely on the papers. And I did get into one, State University of New York at Stony Brook, but most of the places that I applied to rejected me. And one of the places that I applied to rejected me is interesting because the individual there who at that time, and this was around 1990, the individual in SUNY in the English department who was, responsible for graduate admissions, knew the professor that I had that had did this weird number with the letter of recommendation. So anyway, so I called SUNY Buffalo, and I, to check on the status of my application, which I, was not really optimistic about, and I talked to this individual, this professor there at the time, and who knew this other professor, and he told me that I wasn't admitted, but that my letters of recommendation were really good. So I didn't really know what to do with that either, because it's like, well, the letter was unsealed, and like, how would I not know that, right? And then, but like, it was like it was almost like a confession, a pre-confession, but spoken negatively, right? Like, oh well, it's not that you had really bad letters and your letters weren't unsealed, whatever it was, But I knew that my GRE couldn't be any good, so but it, that wasn't. That wasn't part of the excuse as to why I wasn't accepted. And it, the story goes on and on and on. But the point of the story is, the point of the story is that marginalized individuals, right, face real extreme and material challenges from all sorts of institutions that fail to be able to see how their tools and apparati of evaluation and sorting really are, mechanisms in service of social hierarchy